The old man on the porch didn't move. Harlan McCoy looked like he was carved from the same rock as the mountains behind him, all hard lines and silence. The sun beat down on the high plains, turning the grass to a sea of brittle gold. He'd built this life to be quiet, to be alone, because alone was safe. But then he saw it, a speck on the horizon. Not a rider. Something slower, something broken. He watched it for the better part of an hour, a dark shape staggering through the heat. Travelers didn't come this way unless they were desperate, or unless they were trouble. Harlan had seen enough of both to last a lifetime. He told himself to go inside, lock the door, let the prairie swallow whatever was coming. He didn't move. As the figure got closer, he could see it was a woman. Her clothes were ripped, her hair a tangled mess. She walked like every step was tearing something loose inside her. When she finally reached his yard, she looked up, and Harlan felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. Her face was a mask of bruises and dried blood. One eye was swollen shut. She looked like she'd crawled out of her own grave. She stumbled to the porch steps, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't knock. She just stared at him with her one good eye, a look of pure animal terror in it. "Please," she whispered, her voice like sand and rust. "They beat me." She swayed on her feet, clutching a ragged shawl around her shoulders. "They're coming for me," she rasped. I think I'm dying." Harlan had learned a long time ago that letting a stranger into your life was like opening a door to a wildfire. It never ended well. He was a man who kept his doors shut. His past was a ghost that haunted this land, and he didn't need any new ones. But the way she stood there, defiant even as she was about to collapse, it stirred something he'd buried deep. He heard the boards creak as he stepped forward and unlatched the door. He didn't say a word. He just opened it wide and stepped aside. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and leather. He guided her to a chair by the cold hearth, and she sank into it like her bones had turned to dust. He gave her water. She drank it with hands that shook so badly, half of it spilled down her chin. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. "Lahi," she managed to say. "Lahi Bird." He just nodded, taking in the details. The simple dress of a wagon cook, the apron stained with flour and something darker. He went to a small chest and came back with clean rags, whiskey, and a tin of salve. As he knelt to clean the gash on her temple, she flinched, but she didn't pull away. The cut wasn't deep, but the bruises on her arms told a story of brutal, grasping fingers. "You'll live," he said. It wasn't a comfort, it was a fact. "Didn't know where else to go," she whispered, her eyes darting around the sparse cabin, taking in his size, the quiet way he moved, trying to decide if she'd traded one monster for another. He didn't ask who they were, he already had a name in his head. Ezekiel Boonhart, a ranch foreman with a reputation for breaking things, horses, men, and anything else that got in his way. Men like Boonhart left marks like these. As he worked, a storm began to build outside. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the air crackled with a tension that matched the one inside the cabin. He finished bandaging her wounds and stood up, towering over her. She looked so small in that big chair, a broken bird that had fallen from the sky. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and she jumped, a small, sharp sound of fear. He saw it, but he pretended he didn't. He moved to the windows and latched the shutters, plunging the room into a dim, protected twilight. The rain started then, a soft tapping that quickly grew into a roar against the roof. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes again, he was standing by the window, staring out into the storm. His silhouette was massive against the flashes of lightning. He was watching the road, waiting. "You didn't have to let me in," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the rain. He turned his head slightly, his scarred face half hidden in shadow. Door was there. A small, shaky laugh escaped her lips. It was a fragile sound, but for a moment it made the lonely cabin feel a little less empty. Then, in a brilliant flash of lightning, Harlan saw it. A figure on horseback, sitting on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Just a silhouette, unmoving, watching the house through the downpour. Harlan's whole body went rigid. Lahi saw the change in him and followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was there for only a second before the darkness swallowed it again. But they had both seen it. They weren't alone. The storm passed, but the watcher on the ridge had left a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the rain. Harlan didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the door, his rifle resting across his knees, listening to the night. Every gust of wind, every skittering sound outside, was a potential threat. He was a man who knew how to wait. Morning came, sharp and clean. Lahi woke on the small cot he'd set up for her, feeling every bruise and cut on her body. But for the first time in days, she'd slept without dreaming of fists and angry laughter. She sat up and saw him at the stove, frying salt pork. The smell filled the small cabin, a simple, grounding scent of survival. He didn't coddle her. He just set a plate of food in front of her and poured her a mug of coffee, black and bitter. "You need rest," he said, his back to her. "I can't stay," she answered, her voice stronger than the day before. "I'll bring trouble to your door." "Trouble's already here," he said, and didn't elaborate. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to take in the nourishment. When she was done, he handed her a bucket. "Pump's out back. If you're staying, you work." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. Work was honest. Work was real. It was something to hold on to when everything else had been stripped away. She took the bucket and went outside. The air was cold. The ground was muddy, but as she worked the creaking handle of the pump, she felt a tiny spark of herself returning. Later that day, she told him her story. She'd been a cook for a wagon train. Ezekiel Boonhart and his men had ridden into their camp, claiming the wagon master owed them money. They'd taken supplies, horses, and then they'd taken her. "They said I was part of the payment," she said, her voice flat and dead, staring into the fire. "The others, they just watched. They were too scared." Harlan's hands, which had been mending a piece of leather, went still. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. "I ran," she finished. "When they were drunk, I just ran." "You did right," Harlan said, and the simple words were like a balm on a raw wound. But her story wasn't complete. There was a fear in her eyes that went deeper than just the beating. She was hiding something. He could feel it. As she helped him in the barn later, mending a harness, a small, leather-bound book fell from a hidden pocket in her skirt. It was no bigger than his palm. She snatched it up before he could get a good look, her face pale with panic. "Just some recipes," she stammered, shoving it back into her dress. Harlan didn't press, but he knew she was lying. Wagon cooks didn't guard recipe books like they were crown jewels. That evening, the marshal rode out. His name was Red King, a man as weary as the land he was supposed to protect. He didn't dismount, just sat on his horse a few yards from the porch where Harlan was chopping wood. "Heard you got company, Harlan," Red said, his eyes flicking to the cabin door. "Heard right. Folks in town are talking. Pearl Devo is spinning yarns a mile long. They say Boonhart's cook turned up here, looking like she'd been dragged behind a horse." "She's not his," Harlan said, splitting a log with one clean strike. Red sighed, rubbing his tired face. "Boonhart's tearing the county apart looking for her. But here's the thing, Harlan. He's not just talking about a runaway cook. He's telling everyone she stole from him. Something valuable." Harlan stopped chopping. He looked up at the marshal, his eyes dark. "Stole what?" "He won't say, but he's offering a reward that could buy a man a new life. And people are getting greedy. You need to watch your back. This isn't just about pride anymore. It's about money." The marshal tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Harlan alone with the setting sun and a new, more dangerous piece of the puzzle. He went back inside. Lahi was humming softly by the fire, a sound so fragile it almost broke his heart. He looked at her, at the fear she tried so hard to hide, and at the secret she was still keeping. He knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that this woman had brought more than just trouble to his door. She had brought a reckoning, and it was just getting started. That night, Lahi couldn't sleep. The marshal's words echoed in Harlan's mind. Stole what? He watched her as she pretended to rest on the cot, her body tense, her breathing too shallow. The little leather book. It had to be connected. Around midnight, he heard it. The soft crunch of a boot on gravel, just outside the window. He moved without a sound, grabbing the rifle from its place by the door. He peered through a crack in the shutters. 2 men, silhouettes in the moonlight, were creeping toward the barn. Boonhart's men. But they weren't moving like they were there to start a fight. They were moving like thieves. They were looking for something. Harlan slipped out the back door, melting into the deeper shadows behind the house. He circled around, silent as a predator. He watched as they forced the barn door open and lit a lantern. They weren't looking at the horses or the tack. They were pulling up floorboards, tossing aside hay bales, searching frantically. They were looking for whatever Lahi had taken, and they thought she'd hidden it here. He let them search for a few more minutes, then he stepped out of the shadows, the click of him cocking the rifle echoing loud in the night. The 2 men froze, spinning around, their faces pale in the lantern light. "You're on the wrong ranch," Harlan said, his voice a low growl. One of the men, younger and dumber than the other, reached for his pistol. Harlan didn't even raise the rifle. He just took 2 long strides and backhanded the man across the face. The sound was like a whip crack. The man crumpled to the ground, out cold. The second man, older and smarter, dropped his gun and raised his hands. "We don't want no trouble, McCoy." "Then you came to the wrong place," Harlan said. "Get him on his horse and get off my land. And you tell Boonhart, the next time he sends his dogs, I'm putting them down." He watched them ride off into the darkness. Then he went back inside. Lahi was sitting bolt upright on the cot, her eyes wide with terror. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she whispered. "No," he said. He walked over to her, his shadow falling across her. "It's time you told me the truth, Lahi. All of it. What did you really take from him?" Tears welled in her eyes. Her whole body was shaking. She reached into her dress and pulled out the small leather book. Her hands trembled as she held it out to him. "This," she said, her voice cracking. "My father. He was a surveyor. Before he died, he was mapping a claim for Boonhart. But he found something else out there. Something wrong. He wrote it all down, coded it, so no one but me would understand." Harlan took the book. It felt heavy in his big hands. He opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols, numbers, and drawings of rock formations. It looked like nonsense. "What did he find?" Harlan asked. Lahi took a deep, shuddering breath. "He found where Boonhart was hiding his rustled cattle. Dozens of them. He was rebranding them and selling them back to the same ranchers he stole them from. My father was going to go to the marshal, but Boonhart found out. He killed him. He made it look like an accident." So this wasn't about a runaway cook. It was about a book that could hang Ezekiel Boonhart. "Boonhart doesn't know I have this," she continued, her voice gaining a bit of strength. "He thinks my father hid it somewhere on the wagon train. He tore my wagon apart looking for it. That's when he—" She trailed off, unable to say the words. Harlan looked from the book to her bruised face. He finally understood the depth of the danger she was in. This wasn't just about a beating, this was about silencing a witness. Permanently. "He won't stop until he has this book," Harlan said quietly, "and until he has you." A new kind of silence settled between them. It wasn't just the quiet of 2 strangers sharing a roof. It was the heavy silence of a shared secret, a shared enemy. But as Harlan stared at the cryptic symbols in the little book, a cold dread washed over him. He'd seen markings like this before, years ago, in another book, belonging to another man, the man he'd been accused of killing. Suddenly, the ground shifted beneath his feet. This wasn't just Lahi's story anymore, her past, her father's secrets. They were tangled up with his own. And the ghost he'd been running from for 10 years had just walked right through his front door. He looked at Lahi, really looked at her, and he had to force himself to breathe. He knew her father's name, and he knew that the town had the story all wrong. He hadn't killed him. He had tried to save him. The weight of the past crashed down on Harlan. 10 years ago, he'd ridden with a man named Elias Bird. Not a surveyor, but a prospector. They weren't partners, not really, just two men trying to scratch a living out of the unforgiving rock. Elias was a good man, but he was a dreamer, always chasing the next big strike. And he had a secret that got him killed. Now, his daughter was sitting in Harlan's cabin, holding a book filled with the same strange code Elias used to use in his journals, and she thought her father was a surveyor killed by Ezekiel Boonhart. The lies were piled so thick, Harlan didn't know where to start digging. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. The truth was a weapon, and he didn't know if she could handle it. He didn't know if he could. The next few days were a blur of tension. Harlan taught Lahi how to use a pistol. Her hands shook at first, but there was a grim determination in her eyes. She was done being a victim. While she practiced, Harlan worked, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew Boonhart's failed search in the barn would only make him more desperate. The whispers from town grew louder. Pearl Devo, the saloon owner who traded in gossip like gold, sent a boy out with a basket of supplies, a peace offering, or a way to get a look inside the fortress. With the offering was a note, written in elegant script. Boonhart has put a price on your head, McCoy. $1,000, dead or alive. The bounty changed everything. Now it wasn't just Boonhart's men they had to worry about. It was every down-on-his-luck ranch hand, every drifter with a fast gun and an empty wallet. Harlan's isolated ranch had become the center of a storm. One afternoon, as they were reinforcing the corral, Lahi looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt. The folks in town, they say you're a killer. They say you killed a man in cold blood. Harlan didn't stop his work. People talk. Is it true? She pressed, her voice quiet but firm. He finally stopped and looked at her. He saw her father's eyes. The same stubborn hope. The same foolish courage. The man who died was my friend, Harlan said, his voice rough with memories. We were ambushed. I was the only one who walked away. The town decided that made me the killer. He left out the most important part. He left out the name of the man, Elias Bird. Lahi seemed to accept his answer, but a seed of doubt had been planted. She started watching him differently, studying his scarred face, trying to piece together the man from the rumors. The first attempt came 2 nights later. Not a subtle search this time. It was a direct assault. 4 riders, charging the house under the cover of darkness, guns blazing. Harlan was ready. He shoved Lahi to the floor and returned fire from the window. The cabin was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder and splintering wood. Lahi, huddled by the hearth, raised the pistol he'd given her and fired blindly toward the door. It was chaos. A bullet grazed Harlan's arm, hot and sharp. He gritted his teeth and kept firing, his movements economical and deadly. He wasn't a brawler. He was a soldier. He took down 1 rider, then a second. The other 2, seeing the fight was more than they'd bargained for, retreated into the night. In the sudden, ringing silence, Harlan stood panting, the warm trickle of blood running down his arm. Lahi scrambled over to him, her face a pale oval in the darkness. "You're hit," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," he grunted, already reloading the rifle. But as she tore a strip from her skirt to bandage his arm, her hand brushed against a small, raised scar on his wrist. A brand. It was faded, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a simple shape. 2 letters, intertwined, E and B. Lahi froze. Her blood ran cold. She had seen that brand before. On her father's journal. On the saddlebags he carried. It was his mark. Elias Bird. She looked from the brand on Harlan's wrist to the hardened face of the man who claimed to be her protector. The man who claimed her father was his friend. The lies were unraveling, and the truth that was starting to surface was more terrifying than anything Ezekiel Boonhart could ever do to her. Because if this man had her father's brand on his skin, what else did he have? Was he her father's friend, or was he the one who took everything from him? The brand on his wrist, E.B. Elias Bird. Lahi stared at it, her mind racing, trying to connect the pieces of a puzzle she didn't even know she was solving. A brand was a mark of ownership, or partnership. Why would this stranger, this killer, have her father's mark seared into his flesh? "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Harlan looked down at his wrist as if he'd forgotten it was there. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. "It was a long time ago," he said, pulling his sleeve down. "Tell me," she insisted, stepping closer. "Tell me how you knew my father." He turned away, moving to the window to watch the dark plains. "It's not a story for tonight. He wasn't a surveyor, was he?" She pressed, her voice rising. "This book, it's not about rustled cattle." Harlan remained silent, his back a rigid wall. But his silence was an answer. Lahi felt a wave of dizziness. Her entire life, the story of her father, the reason for his death, it was all a lie she'd told herself, built on a foundation of whispers and half-truths from the wagon train. She didn't know who her father really was, and the only man who did was standing right in front of her, refusing to speak. The next morning, the tension between them was a tangible thing. They moved around the small cabin like ghosts, the air thick with questions Lahi was afraid to ask and answers Harlan was unwilling to give. Marshal Red King rode out again, this time with a posse of 2 grim-faced deputies. He wasn't there to offer warnings. "Harlan," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Boonhart's dead." Harlan and Lahi both stared at him, stunned into silence. "Found him this morning on the road to your ranch," Red continued. "Shot in the back. The 2 men who rode with him last night are telling everyone you ambushed them. They're saying you went after him." Harlan's face was stone. "That's a lie." "Maybe," Red said, not meeting his eyes. "But right now, your word isn't worth much in this town. Pearl's got everyone stirred up. They're forming a lynch mob as we speak. I'm here to arrest you, Harlan, for your own protection." It was a trap. Lahi saw it instantly. The marshal wasn't protecting him. He was serving him up to the mob. "You can't," Lahi pleaded, stepping in front of Harlan. "He was here with me all night. He saved my life." Red looked at her with something like pity. "Ma'am, right now, you're just the word of a runaway against half the town. It's not enough." Harlan looked from the marshal's shifty eyes to the nervous deputies. He knew a rigged game when he saw one. He wasn't going to walk into a noose. "No," Harlan said, his voice low and final. And then, everything happened at once. One of the deputies drew his gun. Harlan moved with impossible speed, knocking the gun aside as he shoved Lahi back toward the cabin door. "Get inside! Bar the door!" he yelled. The first shot rang out, not from the deputies, but from the ridge behind the ranch. Everyone froze, looking up. A lone rider sat on a horse, a smoking rifle in his hands. It was the same watcher from the night of the storm. He wasn't one of Boonhart's men. He was someone else entirely. The rider raised his rifle and fired again, Not at Harlan, but at the ground near the marshal's feet. It was a warning shot. "Drop your weapons, Marshal!" the stranger called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "You're interfering with a federal investigation." A federal agent? Out here? The marshal and his deputies looked at each other in confusion. This changed everything. The agent urged his horse down the ridge and rode into the yard. He was dressed in dusty but well-made clothes, and his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He ignored everyone else and looked straight at Lahi. "Miss Bird," he said, dismounting, "my name is Agent Marcus Thorne. I've been looking for your father's journal for a very long time." He turned his gaze to Harlan. "And you must be Harlan McCoy, the man they call the Ghost, the last surviving member of the Elias Bird gang." Lahi gasped, stumbling back. Gang? The world tilted on its axis. Her father wasn't a surveyor, he wasn't a prospector, he was an outlaw, and Harlan McCoy, he wasn't just a friend, he was part of his gang. Agent Thorne smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "It seems we all have some catching up to do. The book you're holding, Miss Bird, isn't a ledger of rustled cattle. It's a map, and it leads to $250,000 in stolen government gold." The secret was out. Not just one secret, but a whole nest of them, writhing and venomous. Her father, the man she remembered as a gentle dreamer, was a notorious outlaw. Harlan, the silent giant who had protected her, was his partner in crime. The brand on his wrist wasn't a mark of friendship, it was the mark of the Bird Gang. Lahi felt like she couldn't breathe. She looked at Harlan, searching his face for some sign of denial, but there was none. Only a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He had lied to her from the very beginning. Agent Thorne took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the small leather book clutched in her hand. "Your father, Elias Bird, and his gang robbed a federal payroll transport 10 years ago. They killed 3 guards. During the escape, the gang was ambushed. Everyone was killed. Everyone except your father and McCoy. Elias got away with the gold. McCoy was found at the scene, wounded, and took the blame for a killing he didn't commit to give his partner a head start." So the town was half right. Harlan was connected to a killing, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. He'd been the loyal soldier, the scapegoat. "We thought Elias died in the wilderness," Thorne continued, his voice crisp and professional. "But it seems he survived long enough to create a new life, and a very clever map to his stolen fortune. A map he hid in a book of codes and gave to his daughter." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Boonhart wasn't after a cattle ledger. He was one of your father's old associates from before the gang. He must have recognized Elias and figured out what he was really hiding. He killed your father for this map, Miss Bird, and Harlan McCoy knew it all along." Thorne's gaze was sharp as a razor. "Didn't you, McCoy? You knew who she was the moment she told you her name? You knew what was in that book." Harlan finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I knew." Lahi felt a fresh wave of betrayal. He had let her believe her own lies, used her ignorance as a shield. Everything he had done, every moment of perceived kindness, was tainted. Was he protecting her, or was he just protecting the map? Suddenly, the gunshot that had killed Boonhart made a terrifying kind of sense. It had come from the ridge, from where Agent Thorne was watching. "You killed him," Lahi whispered, looking at Thorne. "You shot Boonhart." Thorne's thin smile returned. "Boonhart was a loose end, a violent, unpredictable man who was getting in the way of federal property. I simply tidied up, and in doing so, I created the perfect pretense to bring the law down on this ranch and get my hands on that map once and for all. It was a setup from the very beginning. The marshal, the posse, the murder accusation. It was all a charade orchestrated by Thorne. He had used Boonhart's death to corner them, to force their hand. He wasn't here to serve justice. He was here to get the gold, and he didn't care who he had to sacrifice to get it." Marshal King looked pale, realizing he'd been a pawn in a much deadlier game. Thorne held out his hand to Lahi. "The book, Miss Bird, now." Lahi looked from Thorne's cold, determined face to Harlan's conflicted one. She was trapped between two liars, a federal agent who saw her as a key and an outlaw who saw her as, what? A ghost from his past? A responsibility? She clutched the book to her chest. This was the only thing she had left of her father, this legacy of secrets and stolen gold. It had cost him his life. It had nearly cost her hers. She wasn't going to just hand it over. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. Thorne's smile vanished. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice." He drew his pistol, his movements smooth and practiced. He didn't point it at Lahi. He pointed it straight at Harlan's heart. "The book," Thorne repeated, his voice like ice, "or the last member of the Bird Gang dies right here." The world narrowed to the space between them. The sun beat down, the wind whipped dust around their feet, but all Lahi could see was the barrel of Thorne's gun aimed at the man who had, for all his lies, kept her alive. Harlan didn't flinch. He just looked at Lahi, and in his eyes, she saw a decade of regret. "Give it to him, Lahi," he said, his voice quiet. "It's not worth it. It never was. The gold, the map. It was a curse that had destroyed her father and chained Harlan to a life of solitude." She understood now. Harlan wasn't protecting the map. He was trying to escape it, and she had brought it right back to his doorstep. Her hands trembling, she held the book out to Thorne. The agent's eyes gleamed with triumph. He never took his gun off Harlan as he reached out to take the journal. His fingers were just inches away. And that's when the first shot rang out. It didn't come from the yard. It came from the door of the saloon, half a mile away in town. Thorne grunted, a red flower blooming on his shoulder, and stumbled back. His shot went wild, kicking up dust near Harlan's feet. Everyone spun toward the town. Standing on the saloon porch was Pearl Devo, a long hunting rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Beside her were a dozen ranch hands and townspeople, all armed, their faces set and grim. "You heard the man, stranger," Pearl called out, her voice ringing across the plains. "He's under our protection now." The town that had whispered about Harlan, that had feared him, that had been ready to lynch him an hour ago. They had come for him. They had chosen a side, and they hadn't chosen the law. They had chosen the giant. Marshal King looked at the armed townspeople, then back at the wounded federal agent, and a slow, weary grin spread across his face. He drew his own pistol and aimed it at Thorne. "Looks like your jurisdiction just expired, Agent," Red said. Thorne stared in disbelief, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the strange, stubborn loyalty of this forgotten patch of dirt. He had seen Harlan as a relic, an outcast. He hadn't realized that to these people Harlan was one of them. He was their monster, and they would not let an outsider come and claim him. Surrounded and outgunned, Thorne had no choice. He dropped his gun. The standoff was over. In the days that followed, the truth, or at least a version of it, settled over the town. Agent Thorne was taken into custody by Marshal King, his federal investigation turning into a messy jurisdictional dispute that would keep him tied up for months. The story that Pearl Devo spun in her saloon was a masterpiece of creative storytelling. Harlan McCoy, the town recluse, had single-handedly protected a poor orphan girl from a corrupt government agent and a gang of ruthless outlaws led by the late Ezekiel Boonhart. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the truth the town wanted. It was a story that turned their giant from a killer into a hero. The leather book, the map to a stolen fortune, was quietly handed over to the marshal. What he did with it, no one ever asked. The curse was broken. Lahi stayed. She didn't stay at the ranch. With a small loan from a surprisingly generous Pearl Devo, she bought the old abandoned smithy at the edge of town and turned it into a cookhouse. It was small, but it was hers. Ranch hands and travelers started stopping by, drawn in by the smell of fresh biscuits and the quiet strength of the woman who ran the place. Harlan went back to his ranch, back to his solitude, but something had changed. The silence was different now. It was less a wall and more a space he sometimes filled by riding into town and sitting in a corner of Lahi's cookhouse, drinking her coffee, which was still as black and bitter as ever. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. They had survived a storm together, and that created a language all its own. The secrets and lies had been stripped away, and what was left was something simple and strong. Two survivors who had found an unlikely refuge in each other. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Harlan stood on his porch, watching the lights of the town flicker to life. He was no longer a ghost. Lahi stood on the steps of her cookhouse, watching the last rider of the day head down the road. She was no longer a victim. They had both been running from the past, haunted by the ghost of Elias Bird, but by facing that ghost together, they had found something they'd both thought was lost forever. A second chance, a place to call home. The prairie wind blew, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. It was a land of harsh truths and hard-won peace. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like enough. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and justice on the high plains, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. And let us know in the comments below, do you think the town did the right thing? We'll see you in the next one.